Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for our 44th episode of the Restaurant Dealmaker Show, where we discuss pertinent topics regarding the food and beverage industry with industry professionals. I'm very happy today to have Dan Baker as my co-host today. Dan began his restaurant career at age 16, bussing tables, and never looked back. He steadily climbed the ranks in both front and back of the house roles, working in top kitchens and dining rooms across Northern and Southern California. In 2001, Dan opened Marché au Fleurs, a highly regarded farm-to-table restaurant in the town of Ross in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. Over the course of 21 years as chef-owner, he built Marché into a beloved local institution, ultimately culminating in a successful sale of the business in 2022, which was handled by myself through Restaurant Realty Company. We initially worked with Dan in 2000, selling him Mama Teresa's restaurant in San Anselmo in Marin County, and then sold it for him in 2010. Following that chapter, Dan took on the role of Culinary Director for a prominent Bay Area restaurant group, where he oversaw kitchen operations for 9 restaurants across 5 unique concepts, including deep dish pizza, elevated Mexican cuisine, and modern taverns. He then launched a successful consulting business working directly with restaurateurs to develop menus, hire and train key staff, and implement systems to improve operational efficiency and control costs. Now, an active agent at Restaurant Realty Company, Dan leverages his extensive and versatile industry background to help restaurant owners sell their businesses on their terms. His deep understanding of both the emotional and operational sides of ownership allows him to guide clients through the complex sales process with empathy, precision, and professionalism. Dan approaches each transaction with quick responsiveness, attention to detail, and unwavering follow-through. Having successfully navigated numerous change of ownership, health department inspections, ABC license transfers, SBA loan processes, and complex lease assignments, Dan brings a deep understanding of the many moving parts involved in a restaurant transaction. His ability to anticipate potential roadblocks and proactively manage the deals ensures a smooth, efficient path to closing for the benefit of sellers, buyers, and landlords alike. Welcome, Dan, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to begin by asking you the first question. What was your first restaurant job, and what drew you to the industry?
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me today.
Our pleasure.
I kind of had the classic restaurant beginning. I started bussing tables at 16 as soon as I was old enough to work. And I think I knew I always wanted to get into restaurants. My family didn't own any restaurants, but we liked dining out. We were the family with the takeout drawer, the drawer full of takeout menus. And, 2 or 3 times a week, my mom was getting takeout. I felt very comfortable in restaurants. And as soon as I was old enough, I went into this local family-owned Italian restaurant, got a job as a busser on the spot. And as you said, never looked back. I was immediately drawn to the energy, the people, being part of something. And even at like an entry-level position, I felt like a valuable member of the team. So I worked there through the end of high school and then would return summers and holidays through my college years. And eventually I would meet Holly, who would eventually be my wife and business partner for Marche.
Yeah, that sounds like a similar background to how I got in the business, although my father owned a number of restaurants. And so when I turned 15, I got to start washing dishes. I did that on Saturdays and during the various vacations, part-time during the summer. And then after 1 year, I got to cook through high school. And then after that, a couple of college degrees and then a stint in the service and started, full time. But yeah, very similar, starting at a very young age. We both got indoctrinated before we knew any better. I think that's right. That's really what happened. Anyway, so what inspired you and your wife to open Marché au Fleurs in 2001?
Well, I moved to LA. Holly was finishing schooling at UCLA, and I moved down there and started getting into restaurant management. And that's where I started learning more of the behind the scenes. I was tasked with conducting inventory, wine and liquor inventory, running a pre-shift. And I really enjoyed the number side of the business and learning all the inner workings of the restaurant. So I knew that we wanted to open a restaurant, and we were doing a good amount of traveling at that time and kind of refining our vision. We loved the small, unassuming, family-owned places that you would find in France and Italy and Spain at that time and started formulating kind of our vision built around, farm to table, basically, just, one person in the front, one in the back, very ingredient driven cuisine without being pretentious. And that's kind of what moved us. And we would eventually open Marche with those principles in mind.
Very cool. So you opened in 2001, and then 6 months later, 9/11 hit. How did that moment shape your early years in business?
Well, at that point we were winging it. We were very young in our 20s and still learning the business. And when 9/11 hit, like everybody else, we were stunned. But, after a couple hours and kind of settling into this, what would this mean for our business, we decided to stay open, and it was well received from our customers. They were appreciative that we, were able to provide a place for them to come and get away from the news. And then I think this kind of became our standard operating procedure moving forward. Whenever something came up, power outages or flooding in 2006, poor air quality from fires, and eventually COVID, we just kind of put our heads down, asked ourselves, what do we need to do to open tonight or to get through this service, get through this week? And that kind of became our mantra. We were the place that stayed open.
And you mentioned you were closed on Sundays and Mondays. And how did that affect your business and your personal life?
I think from the beginning, not being open on Sundays and Mondays was one of the best decisions we ever made, both for the business and for our personal lives. It allowed me to do like bookkeeping and payroll and things like that on one of the days, half of one of the days, and also, stay attuned what's happening in the industry, go out to eat, travel, take some time to recharge the batteries. And I think I attest that to one of the keys to our longevity and success in the business,
Yeah,
for
and I'm
sure.
sure your employees appreciated that as well.
Yeah, and it allowed you just to have one crew instead of having a 6-day work week or a 7-day work week where you're piecing together two teams. And having everyone knowing their 2 days off, I think did improve our longevity with staff retention for sure.
Yeah, that was, I think, a very good idea to do. And I guess your customer base got used to that, and so it was just they knew that if they wanted to go Marche, it wasn't going to be Sunday or Monday. And
Exactly. And I think that in the early years, that was something that was possible. I think it's harder and harder now for restaurants to have that boundary of 2 days closed because, the costs of rent have increased so much that a
exactly,
lot of restaurants feel pressured to be open more days, and it doesn't offer them that opportunity, which is a
really,
challenge for sure.
yeah, because I mean, you still got to pay rent, you still got to pay insurance, right? Your
Yeah.
utility
Those
costs
fixed
may go
costs.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah, utility costs may go down, but I mean, you still got a lot of fixed costs that are not going to be amortized by those 2 days of no sales. So I know that's an issue. I know when my father decided to convert some of our restaurants to 24 hours, one of the rationale was other than he thought there was a market for a late night business in San Francisco was to help amortize those fixed costs. You had more hours to basically go towards paying rent and insurance and those other costs that keep on going, whether you're open or closed. You build a loyal and longstanding team at Marche. The audience that doesn't know much about the area that Marche is in, it's a town called Ross, which is an extremely high-end demographic. I think the average price home in that area is probably $5 million. It's probably one of the most expensive residential neighborhoods in Northern California for sure. And so it's a very demanding market. And I know from my own past experience being a restaurateur, if you don't execute properly, especially in a very close-knit market such as Ross, you're going to be history. So obviously, what was your approach to creating that culture, and how did you execute so excellently as you did?
Well, as owner operators, we were there every day, and that helps to build a strong team with your employees and also get to know your customers. And I think especially Holly was adept at building those relationships, forging those bonds with both employees and customers, remembering people's preferences, being patient, sympathetic, and empathetic to, what everyone's going through at various time, and working alongside the team builds a lot of respect and naturally creates culture. I always tried to give employees a voice in collaborating on menu and specials. I was always concerned about their financial well-being, making sure they were making what they needed to make to pay their bills, giving advances when necessary. And I think all of those things fostered culture pretty naturally. And I'm very fortunate to say we had employees who were with us from year one all the way through to the end. And, It's cliche, but it really was like a family there.
Sure. And I assume probably some of those employees are still with the current owner today. Is that the
That's
case?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And that was an interesting experience, which we'll talk about shortly here. You and I met initially when you bought your second restaurant in San Anselmo, where I was representing the seller. How did that experience go from your perspective?
Well, it was 2006. Sales at Marché were kind of stagnant, and we convinced ourselves that in order to bring in enough income to support, and we now had a kid, and to eventually not have to be behind the stoves every single day of the week, the answer was opening a second restaurant. It was right in the farm to table movement, and we opened AVA Restaurant, which was a hyper local kind of love letter to California, where everything was sourced in the state, and whether it's grain, wine, produce, obviously, but we have such a bounty here. We wanted to kind of showcase that for our customers. So we opened AVA, and we learned a lot of hard lessons in that experience. Opening restaurants is the fun part. It's a creative outlet. You get to make all these fun decisions and lighting and menu and all of that. But then you have to operate them. And what we found was there really weren't any economies of scale having these two businesses a mile and a half apart. We thought it would, you know, directly improve our bottom line. But what we found was the efficiencies just weren't there. Bouncing from one to the other, having to staff a little heavier because I think an owner is worth about 1.5 to 2 employees as far as how much they care and how hard they work. So by not being present, having both of us there, we had to staff a little heavier. We also learned that employees don't behave the same when the boss isn't around. So if there was a time that neither of us was in one of the locations, almost as soon as you walk out the door, things start going awry. People are, I don't need to go into detail. I think you can
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah.
And then also I miscalculated the concept. And this is something that I apply now when I'm doing, consulting. I have a better understanding of this, but we wanted to be at an approachable price point and offer a very high quality product at a very reasonable price. But because of the size of the restaurant, the number of seats that it had, we weren't generating enough revenue. We only had about 35, 40 seats. We had an outdoor patio that was usable about 6 months out of the year. But when you ran the numbers, if we did 50 or 60 or 70 dinners, two full turns, at the check average, we were at $35, $40 a person, you're just not going to bring in enough revenue to cover your costs. So we remained marginally profitable. The first year was good. And then after that, a little above break even. And that's when the financial crisis of 2008 set in. And that would kind of be a tipping point for that restaurant.
Yes. Yeah, I have seen so many cases where a very successful restaurateur opens restaurant number two,
Mm.
and in more cases than not, it just doesn't work. It's a different mindset altogether once you open open and operate a second restaurant. And so many of the things you said, I have seen other operators, going to restaurant number two experience and then go back to, a single restaurant situation. So, what did the 2008 financial crisis teach you about resilience in this industry?
Well, after we sold AVA with your help at the end of 2009, we went back to Marche and focused all our attention there. And we soon found that revenues increased there because we were both back in the building. And that's when we kind of start hitting our groove at Marche. And for the next 5, 10 years, it enjoyed double-digit growth annually. And what we found was there were always going to be things that came up, you know, economic slowdowns and, as I mentioned, natural phenomenon, disasters, whatever. But if you just kind of put your head down and get through it, which would later become known as pivoting, you could succeed in any economy and with through any adversity.
It's amazing, in reviewing your numbers during the pandemic, which we'll talk about in a minute, they were phenomenal. You just basically, made the right moves and did a fantastic job. Exactly tell the audience what you did differently that helped Marche survive and thrive when so many others didn't during the pandemic.
Well, we were very fortunate to have been located um, in a small community with locals. We didn't depend on offices. So when people stopped coming to work, that didn't affect us. We also had a great patio outdoors and we had space to open a second patio. So For the initial couple months when there was no dining, we did well with takeout. The first week it was all phone orders, and then we quickly saw we needed to get an online store up. So the first weekend of the shutdown, I worked probably 8 hours each day developing a pretty easy to use online store. And then immediately sales doubled and everything we did was working. So, we tried groceries for a few months and that was great. And that got us through. It built bonds with our customers. When we were able to serve outdoors, we had these two patios. The demand was huge. Everyone was excited to get back into restaurants. We never looked back. We were able to actually hire more people during COVID rather than the experience a lot had where they had to let people go, unfortunately. So we were one of the lucky ones. I think we did a lot of things right, but I think that we were also very fortunate to be located where we were. And I feel for those who were on the other side of that. Maybe we're in an area that depended on office workers or didn't have outdoor seating. But I also would give us some credit because our mindset of, let's not wallow in it. Let's make a quick decision. Some weren't sure what to do. Some closed for a couple of weeks and then decided to reopen because we had this established in our DNA to just put your head down and go. It, I think, really benefited us. It endeared us to the community from early on. And I think it paid dividends, for the remaining time we were there.
Yeah. So when you said you did a groceries initially during the pandemic, what do you mean by that? You were selling groceries,
We
selling
were.
food?
It started with, grocery stores were operating, but they had long lines and, the distancing and all of that. The farmers market stayed open as they were deemed essential businesses. And we thought we're going to the farmers market. A lot of people didn't feel safe doing so. So we started buying extra and adding it to our online store, a case of strawberry or a pint of strawberries, and ears of corn or whatever it might be that was in season and selling them. We would fulfill these orders in the mornings and afternoons. We would have a 3 p.m. pickup, and it started like gangbusters from day one. We were doing, two, $3,000, $4,000 sometimes in grocery sales. We had people going through almost like a drive-through with the neighboring building. We would meet them at their trunk, load it into their trunk.
Wow.
Everything was done online, contactless. But, you name it, cases of beer and water and wine to vegetables and fruits,
Wow.
everything, salt,
Very creative.
yeast was hard to come by at that time. It was really creative. It was really fun. All of these things during COVID, it's pretty exhilarating and exciting getting to use your creative mind again.
For
Um,
sure. Did you during COVID, did you use a delivery service to deliver food that you produced?
well, we used DoorDash and Uber
Oh,
Eats,
yes.
so third-party delivery, and we had started with them a little before COVID. It was at a time where it was kind of a 50-50 decision for restaurants. Either you took part and you paid the high commission costs, or you left that revenue on the table. And for some concepts, it made more sense than others. Ours, frankly, could have gone either way. Our food, some of it travels well, some of it less so. When COVID started, they were forced to reduce their commission schedule to 15% in California. And that was a reasonable fee for the amount of business it brought in. It's really a double-edged sword for restaurants using these third-party delivery companies, and I understand why a lot have chosen not to do so. At Marché, we had success doing it. For us, it was more important to get the top line revenue than the profit margins. We'd rather just have more money coming in to pay our employees, keep everybody busy, and we're still or the restaurant is still with those companies today.
Yeah, that's cool. Your numbers were just phenomenal during the COVID period. So
We worked really hard. It
you obviously did a good
was a
job
lot.
executing. That is for sure. So what event or events have been most challenging in your career, and how have you dealt with these challenges?
Well, there have been many little bumps in the road over the years, but I'd say above anything else, it was selling, it was deciding to sell, and then the actual selling of the business that proved to be more challenging than any other operational aspect. There were a few reasons why we decided to sell. Even before COVID, it was already clear that the industry was changing. The labor pool was shrinking. It had been where we would place an ad for a cook and get 20 people to show up for an interview. And then we saw that we would place an ad and nobody would answer that ad, or the only way to get people was word of mouth, or the entry people were looking to make a lot more than they had previously made, which I totally understand. Costs have gone up for everybody's wages went up, but it began to squeeze the independent restaurant operator. So that writing was on the wall. When COVID happened, we had the success. I could predict that was going to change. The first year, everybody was so supportive, so nice. And then in 2021, it just started to feel like it was going the other direction. Business was still strong, but for that reason, along with wanting to have more flexibility in my scheduling, my kids had gotten to the high school and college age and wanting to maintain flexibility to visit them on weekends and not work nights, we decided it was time to sell. And that's when I called you.
Right. And I appreciate that. Thank you for having that opportunity. And selling Marché in 2022 was not easy. What surprised you most about the process, and what's your biggest piece of advice for owners preparing to sell their business?
Well, what I wasn't prepared for was the time it took from start to finish. I think from the time I called you to the time the deal closed was almost 16 months. And we found a buyer quickly. It wasn't looking for a buyer that took the time. There were so many agencies that you have to work with. Health department, ABC, there's the principals in the deal, landlord and the buyer and the seller, but also three attorneys. The buyer had an attorney and then the landlord had an attorney. So I felt like I had to lawyer up as well. And anytime these three are going back and forth, it just delayed things. So it was very frustrating, very emotional for the amount of time it took, draining. The actual sales process, we had a change of ownership health inspection, and what comes up on these inspections seems pretty minor. There's a sink that needs to go in. You need to relocate this ice machine, and the water heater isn't strong enough, to power all the hot water that's needed. Okay, these seem manageable. But in the end, it leads to tearing up the floor, burying the grease trap, connecting all the sinks, installing floor drains, retiling the entire kitchen. During the process, walls are discovered to have some water damage, so they replace the sheetrock. Then the plumbing and the electrical need to be upgraded. The water heater, the way the health department does the water heater test is they turn every faucet in the entire restaurant on hot. And then they measure, is there enough hot water to service all these things at the same time? That to me is one thing that needs to be looked at. You're never going to have every single bathroom faucet, kitchen faucet, all working at the same time, but that's what the code says. So we had to get two tankless water heaters. Those needed to be powered by a new 2-inch gas line. We had laid 150 feet of gas line. And in the end, all said and done, new sinks, new connections, new water heaters. It was about $120,000 remodel. Because we were selling this as a going concern, it was the seller. Usually it's the seller's responsibility to make sure the restaurant is up to code. So that we had to satisfy that. And in order to keep our team in place for the new owner, we paid them. We thought it was going to be a 3 or 4 week closure when we kind of agreed to this deal point. But in the end, it took 14 weeks for this
Right.
construction. So
It was
in the
brutal.
end, we learned a lot. It was very emotional. It was very difficult, but with your help, we stayed the course. To some degree, it's a leap of faith because you're putting a lot of money out there in advance without being guaranteed what the result will be. So, we had some tough conversations at the house. I'm a little less risk averse than Holly is. So, we were kind of feeling conflicted in what the best. Do you just walk away and say goodbye to your business, or do you invest in selling your business? And in the
Right.
end, that's what we did. And fortunately, it worked out.
Yeah, unfortunately, you got a good price. Yeah. Dan brought up a very interesting point that, in many counties in California, especially Northern California, there's a change of ownership health department inspection, which basically sets the bar at the current requirements of today. So in a lot of older restaurants, they just operate normally. They have their yearly or periodic health inspection. But when there's a sale, there is a change of ownership, and the health department wants everything brought up to current standards. And because Dan was in an older building, he incurred a tremendous amount of expense. So one way to circumvent that, if you're selling a going concern, in other words, you're selling the name, menu, proprietary items, as Dan did with Marche, then you have to deal with that. If somebody's going to just by the assets in place, they're going to change the concept. They're going to close down, do some remodeling. Then, as a seller, you can sell it as is and shift that burden of the cost of the change of ownership to the buyer. And then, typically, if that's the case, the price is adjusted accordingly. So it's just something to be aware of if you're in Northern California and you got a aggressive health department that's going to enforce change of ownership health inspection, which is mandatory in many counties in Northern California. It's not a big deal in Southern California as it is here. It really doesn't trigger in Southern California until you do major remodeling, and then you got to bring everything up to code. But anyway, so Dan, after selling Marché, you oversaw operations for a group of 9 restaurants. What was that shift like from hands-on owner-operator to managing from a distance?
Yeah, that was challenging. It took some practice. I didn't have to do a lot of delegating at Marché. I was there. I could be alongside my team, working together. I could, I tried not to micromanage, but let's be real. I think owner operators do a little of that. But when I was overseeing all these other restaurants, I needed to improve my communication skills and my trust in others, and also develop systems to track, key metrics like labor and food cost. And I had to develop more refined recipes in English and Spanish with pictures and build sheets and things, because I wasn't physically there to see the plate, taste the seasoning. At Marché, there was a lot of to taste. We made something, we tasted it, we added a little salt or did this or did that to tweak it. But when you're responsible for all these other kitchens and you can't be there, you have to figure out another way. Another thing that I had to get used to and get comfortable with was keeping an eye on online reviews, which for the most of my time at Marché, we adopted the head in the sand approach. We did not want to see them. We did not respond to them. As an owner operator, it can be difficult to read the feedback. And when you're there and you feel like you're kind of attuned to what's going on, you know what the issues are, having someone give a 1-star review can be just a little more than you can handle after a long work week. So we tried not to read the reviews at Marché. You can't take that approach when you're overseeing restaurants or we have multiple units and you're not there. So that took a little getting used to as well.
Right. And so what are the qualities of a good leader that you regularly practice?
For me, being a good leader means accountability. I'm accountable to my team. I take pride in my follow through, my clear communication. If I make a mistake, I have no problem admitting that. As far as empathy goes, I've worked with some amazing people over the years who haven't had the opportunities that I have had, and I feel for their situations. I'm very happy to talk to anybody who needs help, who's maybe thinking of getting in this business. My name is on quite a few leases around Marin County for people who couldn't get an apartment without a cosigner. So to
Nice.
me, accountability and empathy are kind of my leadership, what I consider to be important.
Right. That's very admirable. So after you were with that restaurant group, you next phase was you opened a restaurant consulting business. And what are your strongest areas of expertise, and how do you use these strengths to overcome the major challenges of the business, and how that related to your success in the consulting business?
Well, having had 35 years in the restaurant business, I feel that I'm good with both the creative aspects, the design process, menu development, recipes, curating a wine list or a beverage program, but also the numbers part of the business. And a lot of people favor one over the other. I enjoy both. So I can help upstarts, decide if a project is viable, if they should really be doing this, look at the lease, what is the rent, can they make money there, applying what I learned at the second restaurant AVA. How many seats are there? What is your check average going to be? Can you bring in the revenue? Is this business even something you should consider? In many cases, I am talking people out of getting involved in a certain project. I'm also becoming an expert with this health department process, having gone through it, as we've discussed. I've recently been a panelist on the County of Marin Health, EHS, Environmental Health, did a workshop where they're trying to kind of bridge the gap between the public, the restaurant, and the health department, kind of finding common ground and figuring out how to make the process a little easier. I was a panelist on a couple of topics to try to kind of help improve this process. And make things more reasonable for all sides.
That's great. So, what led you to get your real estate license and join Restaurant Realty, which we're very grateful that you did?
And thank you for that opportunity. After selling, Marché, I knew I still loved restaurants and I wanted to stay restaurant adjacent. I speak chef, I speak general manager. I love being in kitchens. I just didn't really want to work nights anymore. So the consulting and the real estate allows me to do that. My recent experience selling Marché makes me somewhat uniquely qualified to help other owners get through the same process. So I consider myself kind of a guru with working with sellers to prepare themselves, which in some cases, be getting their books and records in order, cleaning up their taxes, getting their business in the best possible state to sell it, get it cleaned up, keep revenue strong. So to me, it was a very comfortable transition from owning to stepping into this kind of, this field of real estate.
Yes. Yeah, because you've got a very wide range perspective, being an operator, dealing with landlords, dealing with all the bureaucratic agencies, venue development, lease negotiation, marketing, the whole nine yards. So that really makes you an expert and helps get to the finish line with the owners and selling their business. What are the biggest mistakes you see people make when buying or selling a restaurant?
For buyers, I would say being undercapitalized, not having enough money to weather the early ownership change. There's a lot of costs going out the door before a buyer starts even opening for business.
Yes. So in
Also,
light in
having a
light of
lack,
that, excuse me, in light of that,
yeah.
what recommendation do you have for a buyer in terms of the amount of working capital they should have, um, once they, purchase the restaurant, to deal with, rainy days, worst case scenarios, earthquakes, all kinds of unforeseen situations that may come up. Is there some thumb rule you have?
Well, for savvy buyers, they look at month to month revenues and they have an idea of the busy and the slow season. And they're able to predict their expenses with more accuracy. As a general rule, we recommend 6 months of payroll as a kind of a number to estimate what they will need. So if the monthly payroll is, $10,000, they need to have $60,000 of operating capital in addition to being open and generating revenue, building an inventory, and so on. The challenge for upstarts is, like you said, weathering the unexpected. And as we've seen in this business, there's always something that comes up, power outages and other, economic things. So it's always better to have a little more than you need. And because, there are restaurants that they're just one utility bill away from, not being able to pay that and being forced to close.
Absolutely. So having a reserve, I think the 6 month payroll is a good barometer to
Yeah,
have.
I also see that a lot of buyers are lacking experience and they think that they want to get into this business because it looks fun or they had a friend who did it and did well,
Yes,
but there's no substitute for experience. So I encourage anybody who's thinking of doing this to work at least a couple of years doing the job that you'll be doing. So if you're going to be owning a restaurant, you need to kind of manage a restaurant and do all aspects, all positions. You're at a huge disadvantage when you take over a business and you don't know how to do all of the different stations in the job in the restaurant because when someone calls out sick, you're kind of in a tough spot and you end up being overly dependent on your team and that can hurt you and also cause a lack of respect from your team, but also hurt you when it comes time to wages and being kind of at their mercies. You must be able to do everything that you're expecting your employees to do. You need to be able to do it yourself.
absolutely. And just jump back to the buying side again. When we screen buyers, most landlords' criteria is that they have, this is assuming you're buying an independent, non-franchise, non-chain restaurant. In other words, an independent restaurant, that the buyer has, minimally 3 to 5 years ownership and or management experience of a similar type restaurant he's opening, as well as having, the financial resources, having enough working capital, et cetera. So it's imperative, again, for non-franchise, non-chain that, a buyer must have experience. Otherwise, they're not going to get to first base with the landlord. Just
Right.
plain and
And
simple.
landlords now landlords have always been risk averse, but with COVID, they're even more so. They
Yes, because
just don't want to sign on a tenant that they don't deem qualified.
yeah, the cost to landlords can be extremely high if the tenant does not work out, if they have to go through an eviction, they have loss of rent, they have to pay a commission to, get somebody new there. They may have to give the new tenant free rent, may even have to make a contribution to improvements. It's very, very costly for a landlord. So that's another major reason why they want to make sure they get a very qualified person to basically occupy that restaurant space. So
As
as
far
we
as
mentioned,
this,
Dan, through our discussion today, the many changes have occurred in the hospitality industry. And because of the current economic challenges we face today, shortage of employees, the high operating costs of employees, products, occupancy, and other expenses, and quite frankly, costs for operators are rising far greater than the operator's ability to basically raise prices. So as a result of that, their costs are going up, but they can't raise their prices commensurate with the increased operating costs. So therefore, their margins are being chiseled away. How do you see the hospitality industry, California, dealing with this? And then coupled with, $20 minimum wage for fast food franchises as of April 2024 for any franchise chain with 60 or more units, $20. And that sort of set the bar for the rest of the industry.
absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you suggest people handle and deal with these changes in the industry?
Well, I think there's a lot of creative people out there who are trying a lot of different things. We've seen more and more of kind of the middle range full service restaurants are going away, and there's more and more either counter service or takeout and delivery models. I feel like the independent operators getting squeezed, and there'll be fewer and fewer of those types of restaurants with the type that I ran. In order to have the financial wherewithal to run a business like that, I see restaurant groups, with higher, buying power, owning multiple units, making a little less at each one, but having 6 or 7 units with a team. I think a lot of the trends are heading that way. Their independent operator can't get a loan like they used to be able to get. The SBA is being forced to be more discriminating as well. The high costs of construction make it difficult for entry into restaurants. I think those who will succeed eventually are the ones who have something to say, some kind of edge, something they're bringing that's different. And that's, where I see long term where this is going. In the short term, people are trying everything just to figure out whether it's reducing hours, increasing hours, opening for lunch or closing for lunch. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of that paying off for small businesses, but there are always going to be people who want to get into this field. Extremely rewarding for those who have that in their kind of their blood. Even though I was thrilled to be able to exit the industry, every so often I miss it and think like maybe I could open just a small sandwich shop or something small that's more manageable. But I think it's difficult. It's a difficult time for restaurants for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, you just said restaurants need to have something to say. What do you mean by that?
I think that you need, why are you getting into this business? Why should customers come to you? What are you offering that your competition isn't? And I think that, in this AI generation, what people will be craving is human connection, human interaction, and hospitality, I think, still is king. So if you're going to get into this industry and if you want to succeed, I think you need to ask yourself, what are you doing differently or what are you doing well? What is your vision? If you can't answer those questions, and it could be something simple. We offer, the best smash burger around, or we remember your order because we have a system of keeping track of your preferences, or we have the easiest online ordering platform, or whatever it is. We have the best hot sauce around. But if you're just kind of going through it, there was a time where you could offer a good product at a fair price and you would do well. I think those days are unfortunately behind us. You need to do something better. The competition's fierce. The margins have shrunk. At Marché in the early years, even on low revenues, we could take 20 to 25% to the bottom line. And now I think restaurants are lucky to take 7. A lot of restaurants 3, 4, 5%. In order to get an edge on the others, you need to do something well, market it well, talk about it. Maybe you're creative with social media marketing, whatever it is that you're good at, lean into that.
Yeah, very good input. Thank you. Of all the many accomplishments you've achieved throughout your career, what single accomplishment is most meaningful to you?
Well, I'd say more than any recognition from any publication or third party. I think it was being able to run Marche as a successful business, but prioritize my family first. Um, I feel fortunate we built something that resonated with the community. We had incredible staff retention, built long-lasting bonds with customers and employees. But through all the ups and downs, I was able to be present for my kids, and not compromise with some of the early boundaries that we set, like being closed 2 days a week and closing 2 weeks a year for vacation. It's so hard for restaurants, and unfortunately, it can take a toll at home. So I'm proudest of that we ran a successful business and didn't sacrifice at home.
Well said. Well, Dan, thank you for sharing your accomplished background, which I believe will serve as a role model for those folks that want to exit restaurant operations and ownership and advance into restaurant sales and consulting. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to do so?
The best way is to email me at dan@restaurantrealty.com. My signature plate contains a link to my consulting business as well. So if you're in need of consulting or want to, discuss possibly selling your restaurant, that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate your participation today. And thanks our audience for joining us. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at steve@restaurantrealty.com, or I can be reached toll free at 888-995-9701. Take care of yourself, take care of others. And again, thanks for joining us today. And Dan, thank you for the excellent input that you gave us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sure, it's a pleasure.